All right, so you're super interested in really getting a good grasp on like these complex issues, right? Like going way deeper than those like, those quick sound bites and everything. But the thought of like trying to sort through just mountains of information.
It can be pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we get it.
That's why we're here. We do that work so you don't have to. We
Exactly.
sift through all the material and extract those key insights.
Yeah, and show how it all kind of connects.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So today what we're diving into is The Dark Side by Jane Mayer.
Yeah, an absolutely fascinating book, and really gives you this incredible insider perspective on how the Bush administration responded to the 9/11 attacks. And it's not just about, what happened in those immediate days and weeks after, but really digging into the legal and ethical kind of shifts that happened as a result of those counterterrorism policies that were put in place.
Yeah. And it's wild. Like, Mayer paints this picture of the White House right after 9/11, like just a real sense of panic.
Yeah.
And it's not just about like the horror of the attacks themselves, right?
Right.
It's this very real fear of like, what else is coming.
Yeah, that uncertainty.
Yeah.
Know what's next, what's coming down the line.
Yeah, Mayer mentions this specific incident on October 18th, 2001, just over a month after 9/11. And there was this alarm that went off in the White House.
Yeah, not a fire alarm.
Not a fire alarm. No, no, no.
Something much more serious.
Something far scarier.
It's designed to detect, really dangerous, things like radioactive agents, chemical or biological weapons.
I mean, you can only imagine, like everyone in the Situation Room that day, right?
Yeah.
I thought they were exposed to something. I mean, this included Vice President Cheney.
Yeah.
There was a genuine concern that he might have been, like, lethally infected.
Like, this was serious stuff.
Really serious. And yet, through all of this, he very calmly informed the National Security Council, of the situation.
Pretty remarkable, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really underscores that whole, like, atmosphere of, like, intense fear and uncertainty they were operating under, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this wasn't just about a single attack. It was this underlying assumption that those initial attacks, might have been just the start of something far bigger, right?
Yeah.
Like potentially something much more multifaceted.
Yeah. And that's really key, right?
Yeah.
That they weren't just responding to what had already happened. They were preparing for what they thought might be coming next.
Exactly.
And in that environment, the Bush administration, which was up to that point, really focused on this traditional like Cold War threats.
Yeah.
They were caught really off guard by the nature of al-Qaeda and this new type of warfare, what we call asymmetric warfare.
Right. So basically you have a smaller force.
Right.
Less conventional, using unexpected tactics against, a much larger, more traditional military power.
Yeah, it's like, David versus Goliath, but with like, a whole different set of rules.
Right.
And Mayer actually draws this really interesting comparison here with FDR's response after Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
Right. There was this immediate push to understand, like, what went wrong? How did this happen?
An after-action review.
Yeah.
Figure out what went wrong so you can fix it.
Right. But Mayer says that's not what the Bush White House did.
Right. Instead of really focusing on what was a massive intelligence failure, and a lack of attention to this threat at the highest levels of government, they kind of kicked that can down the road.
Right. It's like they missed this crucial chance for self-correction right from the beginning.
Exactly. They just shifted straight into action and response mode without really taking the time to understand, what led to those failures in the first place.
Yeah. And that response, as Mayer goes on to detail, really started pushing against these pretty fundamental legal boundaries.
Yeah.
And she brings in the perspective of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was a presidential historian.
Right.
And he argued that what the Bush administration was doing legally in the name of fighting terror went way beyond anything that had happened in American history when it came to like, limiting civil liberties.
Yes, Schlesinger, he drew these direct comparisons to historical events like the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Yeah.
Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, during the Civil War, which is this legal principle that protects against unlawful detention and even the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II.
Yeah.
And his argument, as Mayer presents it, is that what the Bush administration was doing was a huge escalation. It went even beyond those, previous moments in American history that we tend to look back on with a lot of concern.
Yeah, it's this idea of like a quantum leap, as you said, in terms of asserting presidential power when it comes to national security. Yeah, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. Mayer really focuses on Vice President Cheney's early statements as kind of setting the tone for how this whole new approach was going to play out.
Yeah.
And that Meet the Press interview he did right.
Yeah.
Yes. Just days after 9/11.
Yeah.
Where he talked about working sort of the dark side. I mean, that's pretty striking.
Yeah, that's a really revealing statement delivered in his, typical sort of measured way.
Yeah.
But it really signals a significant shift towards covert operations. Less emphasis on public accountability and, those traditional legal constraints.
Yeah.
He's basically saying we're going to be operating in the shadows.
Yeah.
We're going to be using any means necessary, and we're not going to talk about it publicly. That's a really big deal.
Yeah, and that really sets the stage for a lot of what Mayer goes on to describe, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, speaking of things that they probably wanted to keep out of the public eye, right? Mayer goes into these pretty significant failures in intelligence leading up to 9/11.
Yeah, the story about that one phone number that was connected to bin Laden is a really good example.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's crucial to understand here that the FBI, even before they had finished that report on the embassy bombings, they shared this number with the CIA and the NSA. And it became this absolutely vital piece of intelligence that bin Laden and his top people were using as a central means of communication.
Yeah. And about a year and a half before the attacks, the CIA intercepted communications on that line about a meeting that was going to take place in Kuala Lumpur in January 2000.
Right.
And they even identified one of the attendees as Khalid al-Mithar, who would later become one of the 9/11 hijackers.
Right.
So it's not that they didn't have information.
That's the point.
Yeah.
They had pieces.
They knew who some of these people were. They knew what they were up to.
Yeah.
But they failed to act on it.
Yeah. And the 9/11 Commission's investigation found that the CIA knew that Hazmi, who's another suspect, had entered the U.S. a year and a half before the attacks.
Right.
But they didn't share that information with anybody.
No.
I mean, not with the FBI, who handles domestic counterterrorism.
Right.
They didn't even add his name to the State Department watch list. I mean, think about that for a minute. You've got the CIA. They know that a known terrorist operative is inside the United States.
Right.
And they don't alert the agency that's responsible for domestic security.
Yeah.
They don't even put his name on a list that could have, flagged him if he tried to do something. I mean, that's wild.
Yeah, it's like a textbook case of communication breakdown.
Absolutely.
Just total bureaucratic inertia, right?
It's not just that they didn't have the information. It's that they had it and they didn't do anything with it.
Right.
It's even worse.
And it wasn't just like a simple oversight either.
No.
Mayer explains that this key cable from Bangkok warning about Mithar,
Yeah.
it was mislabeled by the CIA's counterterrorist center.
Right.
They marked it as information.
It was just interesting, but not really urgent.
Yeah.
When it should have been flagged as action.
Right. Which would have, triggered an immediate follow-up.
Right.
A tiny bureaucratic error,
Yeah.
but with, massive consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's really wild is that during the same time period, there are actually FBI agents working inside the CIA's counterterrorist center.
Right. It was this thing called the hostage exchange program.
Yeah.
Kind of ironically named, right?
Yeah.
But it was supposed to improve cooperation between the two agencies.
Yeah.
Get them talking to each other more.
And one of those agents, Doug Miller, he actually saw these electronic communications about Hazmi being in the U.S.
Yeah.
And Mayer says that he asked his CIA supervisor twice if he could share that information with the FBI.
And he was denied.
And he was denied twice.
Twice.
Yeah, just unbelievable.
Really emphasizes those deep-seated, issues between these agencies. Right?
Yeah, like these guys are supposed to be working together to, prevent these kinds of attacks, and they're not even allowed to talk to each other.
That's right.
It's wild.
It's crazy.
And, Mayer contrasts this with the earlier cooperation under President Clinton.
Right.
So in 1996, Clinton declared this kind of war against al-Qaeda, and he directed the whole intelligence community to actually work together.
Right.
to build a legal case against bin Laden.
So they could prosecute him, in court.
Right. So they actually created these fusion cells where people from different agencies were working together, and they recruited these key al-Qaeda informants.
Yeah, it was a real collaborative effort.
Yeah.
And it shows that it was possible for these agencies to work together effectively.
Right. It wasn't always this dysfunctional.
Right.
And even within the CIA, there were these, different views on how to handle bin Laden.
Yeah. Mayer mentions that some of Tenet's own people, like Cofer Black, they felt that Tenet was being too cautious,
Right.
too hesitant to take more aggressive action against bin Laden before 9/11.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that Tenet himself, he never actually advised Clinton or Bush to authorize lethal force against al-Qaeda before 9/11.
Oh, wow.
He said he was worried about the political fallout.
Mm-hmm.
If the U.S. was seen as assassinating Arab terrorists in Afghanistan, the political risk was just too high for him.
Yeah, so it's this real tension, right?
Yeah.
Between wanting to act and then being afraid of the consequences.
Yeah.
And then, of course, everything changes after 9/11.
Right.
And Mayer talks about how Tenet immediately moved to protect the CIA
Right.
from any kind of scrutiny.
Yeah, he went to Camp David just days after the attacks, and he got Bush to promise that there wouldn't be any formal investigations into the CIA's pre-9/11 record on al-Qaeda.
Wow.
And he framed it as, protecting the people who were out there risking their lives,
Yeah.
But Mayer suggests that while he was saying that, it also protected him
Right.
from having to answer for all those missed opportunities.
Yeah. And those missed opportunities were not just like, isolated incidents.
No, I mean, the Midhar and Hazmi thing was just one example.
Right.
The CIA also had all this information suggesting that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who later became known as the mastermind of 9/11, was plotting attacks inside the U.S.
Right.
But they didn't connect those dots.
Yeah.
They didn't put the pieces together. They had the puzzle pieces, but they weren't putting the puzzle together.
Right.
It's really a failure of imagination,
Yeah. Yeah.
to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And then there's Cofer Black,
Right.
who was running the counterterrorist center at the CIA.
Yeah.
And even though, officially combating terrorism was the top priority, some of his own colleagues, they didn't think he was giving it enough attention.
Yeah.
They thought his track record was kind of inconsistent.
Yeah.
And Mayer talks about his background,
Yeah.
how he played a key role in capturing Carlos the Jackal in Sudan in 1994. And then, there was that alleged assassination plot against Black himself by bin Laden.
All right.
And, it seems like that really created this intense desire for revenge against al-Qaeda and Black.
Yeah.
It became very personal for him.
Yeah, like a vendetta almost.
Yeah.
And before 9/11, there were even plans being developed to capture bin Laden.
Right.
Mayer describes this plan by Michael Scheuer to kidnap bin Laden and have him rudely questioned in Egypt.
Yeah.
But the FBI blocked it.
Right. John O'Neill, who was the FBI's counterterrorism chief, he argued to Attorney General Janet Reno that this plan was basically an illegal abduction.
Right.
And, who knows what they might have done to him in Egypt?
Yeah.
Outside of American legal oversight.
Yeah.
And Reno, she only approved a snatch operation if bin Laden was first indicted in the U.S. and then brought here to face charges.
Right.
Not sent to Egypt for, off-the-books questioning.
So it's really interesting to see that contrast.
It really is.
Right. This idea of, operating within legal boundaries.
Yeah.
And then after 9/11, that all changes.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
I mean, after 9/11, Black basically said, the CIA's only concern is killing the terrorists.
Wow.
Like, straight up.
And that's a huge shift.
It is.
Right. From legal prosecution to just, taking them out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Mayer actually quotes someone from a meeting with British intelligence officials who said the whole conversation was rather blood-curdling. Like, it really shook them up, to hear Black talk like that. And Black himself, as he was leaving that meeting, he said that they would all probably be prosecuted for what they were planning to do.
Wow.
And it wasn't said with any fear.
Oh.
It was almost like he was relishing it.
Yeah, like he was looking forward to it almost.
Yeah. And it's really chilling. Mayer also mentions this disturbing suggestion that Black made about using a machete to get DNA proof of bin Laden's death.
I mean, that's just dark.
Yeah. It's really unsettling.
Yeah.
And, in this environment of just intense urgency and this perceived need to do whatever it takes,
Right.
Mayer points out that memorandum of notification from September 17th, the one that gave the CIA all those new powers,
Yeah.
it just sailed through the approval process.
Yeah.
Hardly any debate. No real scrutiny.
Wow.
And that's unusual. I mean, normally, these covert action findings, they'd be reviewed by lawyers from all the different government agencies.
Right.
Then they go to the cabinet officials.
Yeah.
And then finally they'd reach the president.
Right.
But not this one.
No.
The CIA got these enormous new powers, including in areas like interrogation and detention, where they hadn't really had much experience before. And it all happened so fast.
Yeah.
With very little oversight.
And that lack of debate and that lack of review, it really made a lot of people within the agency uneasy.
Yeah, particularly those older veterans who remembered all the scandals from the past.
Yeah.
They were worried about where the agency was headed.
Yeah.
Worried about unintended consequences.
Yeah, and the authority that Congress gave Bush right after 9/11 to use all necessary and appropriate force against anyone connected to the attacks was super broad.
Yeah.
But Mayer highlights this last-minute effort by the White House to make it even broader.
Yeah, so just as the language was about to be sent to Congress, the White House, through Senator Lott, insisted on adding the words "in the United States" to the definition of the president's battle zone.
And Senator Daschle was really troubled by this.
Yeah, he saw it as this really bizarre request. Why would you need to specify that the president can use force against people inside the United States?
Yeah.
Unless you were planning on doing just that.
Right.
And Daschle recognized that this seemingly small change could potentially give President Bush the authority to treat American citizens inside the U.S. as enemy combatants.
Yeah.
Which is a huge deal.
Yeah, it raises some serious constitutional questions about the limits of executive power. Right?
Huge ones.
Yeah.
And within a week of the attacks, the Justice Department sent over this secret memo.
Yeah.
And it basically argued that in a national emergency, the president could authorize military action inside the United States.
I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah. So we're talking about raiding homes, shooting down civilian airliners, setting up military checkpoints.
Wow.
And this memo went even further.
Yeah.
It said that the president could basically ignore the Fourth Amendment.
Which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures?
Right. And he could also ignore laws that specifically prohibited warrantless surveillance of Americans.
I mean, that's a total overturning of established law.
Absolutely.
And Mayer also emphasizes that the Bush administration lawyers, they believe that even laws prohibiting torture, secret detention, and warrantless surveillance could be set aside.
Yeah, if they were seen as getting in the way of the president's ability to protect national security, it's this incredibly expansive view of executive power.
Yeah. And Mayer kind of compares this to other presidents who've expanded their authority during wartime.
Right, like Lincoln and FDR.
Right.
But she points out that they never claimed it was their routine right to do so.
Yeah.
Nixon came closest.
Yeah.
But even he faced a ton of pushback.
Yeah.
But this Bush administration, it was different. They were claiming this whole new level of presidential authority.
Yeah, and it's clear from Mayer's book that Bush himself was pretty comfortable with this whole idea of being a wartime president.
Yeah, she even says that he'd thought about the opportunities that wars give presidents to advance their agendas.
Right.
And he was drawing on his father's experience after the first Gulf War. How his dad kind of wasted all that political capital he'd gained.
Right.
And Bush, he didn't want to make that same mistake.
Yeah. And Mayer even mentions that Bush had started calling himself the commander-in-chief a lot.
Yeah, like even in private.
Wow.
So you can see how he was really embracing that role.
Yeah, and Mayer identifies David Addington as the architect of this whole expansive interpretation of presidential power.
Right.
And he was Cheney's legal counsel.
Yeah, and he had these really deep conservative convictions.
Yeah.
And he was super prepared for national emergencies because he'd been involved in all these continuity of government exercises.
So like what happens if there's a nuclear attack or something?
Right.
Yeah.
So he'd been thinking about these things for a long time. And Addington worked closely with John Yoo, who was a lawyer at the Justice Department.
Right.
And together they came up with this legal strategy for the war on terror.
Yeah, and their argument was basically that the president as commander-in-chief could ignore almost any legal limitations if he thought it was necessary for national security.
Right. And that's a pretty radical view.
Yeah.
A lot of legal scholars disagreed with it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Even some conservative lawyers within the administration were worried about it.
Yeah.
One of them even called Addington a lunatic.
Wow.
So it's a pretty controversial idea.
Yeah.
But that idea became the foundation for what they called the new paradigm.
And what was that?
So it's this legal strategy to basically reclassify the fight against terrorism as a military war,
Right.
not a criminal justice matter.
Right.
And that meant that they could capture, interrogate, even kill suspects really quickly
Yeah.
without having to worry about all those messy due process rules.
And their justification for that was that the courts were too slow.
Right.
Too cumbersome to deal with this new kind of threat.
They needed to be able to act fast,
Yeah.
gather intelligence.
Prevent future attacks.
Yeah.
And Mayer goes into Addington's background, too.
Yeah, she talks about how he grew up in a military family,
Mm-hmm.
and he worked at the CIA early in his career under William Casey.
Right.
And he loved covert operations.
Yeah.
And he hated the reforms that were put in place after Vietnam and Watergate.
Yeah.
He thought they'd weaken the presidency.
Right.
And Mayer draws this connection to the Iran-Contra scandal.
Yeah.
She explains that both Addington and Cheney, they viewed executive power through the lens of that whole post-Watergate period.
Yeah.
And they resented all those constraints that had been put on the presidency.
Yeah.
They saw it as an attack on the power of the executive branch.
Yeah. And they had this tendency to turn political disagreements into like these huge legal battles over presidential authority.
Yeah, it was all about principle for him. And Addington, he really dominated those White House legal meetings.
Uh-huh.
And he had a lot of influence over the Pentagon's legal office.
Yeah.
He helped his protege, William J. Haynes III, get the top legal job there.
Wow.
So he was really shaping the legal landscape of the war on terror.
Yeah, and one of the most controversial parts of that landscape was that secret warrantless eavesdropping program.
Yeah.
Mayer reports that even the Deputy Attorney General Larry Thompson, he was kept in the dark about it.
Yeah.
He wouldn't even sign wiretap permission forms because he didn't understand the legal justification.
Right. I mean, that shows you just how secret this program was.
Yeah.
Even the number 2 guy at the Justice Department didn't know about it.
Yeah.
And then Jack Goldsmith, he takes over the Office of Legal Counsel.
Uh-huh.
And he's stunned when he finally sees the legal work that John Yoo did to justify the program.
Yeah.
He basically called it a deliberate attempt to circumvent FISA,
Yeah.
which is the law that governs government surveillance. And he said that Yoo's opinions were flimsy
Yeah.
and intentionally kept secret.
Yeah.
So it's pretty clear that the administration was operating outside the law when it came to national security.
Yeah, and then Mayer shifts the focus to the case of John Walker Lindh.
Right. The so-called American Taliban.
Yeah.
And Mayer notes that Lynn's father, he publicly complained about what he called a bipartisan campaign without the facts
Right.
against his son.
Yeah.
And Mayer gives some really interesting context to Lynn's story.
Right.
He arrived in Afghanistan in the summer of 2001.
Uh-huh.
At a time when the U.S. actually had a pretty decent relationship with the Taliban.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we were even giving them aid for opium eradication.
Wow.
So it was a totally different world back then.
Yeah.
And then everything changed after 9/11.
Right.
And Lindh claimed that he didn't understand that he was at war with the U.S.
Yeah.
That he didn't see the connection between the civil war in Afghanistan and global terrorism.
But the government obviously didn't buy that.
No. They said it wasn't credible.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to think about how his situation might have been different if 9/11 hadn't happened.
Right. Yeah. And Mayer takes us back to the CIA right after 9/11.
Yeah.
And she talks about how Cofer Black was demanding bin Laden's head on a platter.
Yeah.
And there's this crazy cable from the Jawbreaker team in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
They requested a container, dry ice, and even pikes.
Yeah.
Like they were going to put bin Laden's head on a spike.
Yeah. It's a pretty graphic image.
Yeah, really dark.
Yeah. It shows you the kind of mindset they were in.
Yeah, just this raw desire for revenge.
Yeah.
And then just a few months later, John Walker Lindh surrenders.
Right.
And he identifies himself as an American citizen who needs help.
Yeah. It's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah.
And just 2 weeks before Lindh surrendered, Cheney gave this really hardline speech
Right.
where he said that terrorists don't deserve to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions.
What?
And he said that even before Bush had formally approved that policy.
So he was really setting the stage for what was to come.
Yeah. It's really important to understand this point.
Yeah.
Because by saying that these detainees weren't entitled to the protections of the Geneva Conventions,
Right.
it really dehumanized them.
Yeah.
And it removed those legal and ethical restraints on how they could be treated.
Yeah, and Mayer talks about how the Bush administration, they basically created this whole new legal system for terror suspects.
Right.
And they did it in secret.
Yeah.
And they deliberately excluded all these experienced military and international law experts.
Right.
And they really wanted to use military commissions to try these suspects
Yeah.
because it gave them more control over everything.
Right. The detention, the interrogation,
Yeah.
the prosecution.
Yeah.
But using military commissions in this way,
Yeah.
it was really legally unprecedented.
Yeah.
And it raised all these questions about the Uniform Code of Military Justice and whether they even needed congressional authorization.
Yeah.
And Mayer points out this long-standing distinction in the American military
Yeah.
between killing an enemy in war and torturing a defenseless captive.
Right.
She even brings up George Washington,
Yeah.
who ordered his troops to treat British prisoners humanely during the Revolutionary War,
Wow.
even though they were considered illegal combatants.
Right.
So this was a big shift in thinking.
Yeah, for sure.
And then we've got Judge Lawrence Silberman.
He?
He was a big name in the conservative legal movement.
Uh-huh.
And his protege, John Philbin.
Yeah.
And Philbin had no experience in military or national security law,
Wow.
but he ends up drafting the executive order that creates the military commissions.
And Cheney presents this order to Bush during a private lunch.
Yeah, and this seems to be the first time Bush actually saw it,
Wow.
and he approves it right there.
Just like that.
Yeah, no real vetting, no input from other advisors.
Wow.
And on the other side, you've got Michael Ratner,
Yeah.
who was a prominent left-wing lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
And he immediately saw this military commission order as this huge illegal power grab by the president.
Yeah.
And he said it went way beyond anything Congress had authorized.
Yeah.
So you can see how controversial this whole thing was.
Right from the start.
Yeah.
And then almost immediately after 9/11, you start to see the beginning of extraordinary rendition.
Yeah, this super shady program where they were abducting terror suspects and sending them to other countries for interrogation.
Yeah.
And Mayer talks about this incident in Karachi, Pakistan on October 26, 2001,
Uh-huh.
where they grabbed a suspect and flew him out on a U.S. registered jet.
Yeah.
And that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
There was another incident in Sweden in December 2001
Yeah.
with masked men and U.S. and Egyptian officials.
Yeah.
And they seem to be conducting this secret operation without any Swedish legal authority.
Mm.
And then you've got the capture